the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. And today I am lucky enough to be joined by JD Jordan. JD, welcome to the Florida Writer Podcast. Could you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Sure thing, and thanks for having me. My name is JD Jordan. I'm the author of the sci-fi Western novel Calamity, being an account of Calamity Jane and her gunslinging green man. I also have been featured in smaller formats, both fiction and nonfiction, around the internet, Creative Loafing, the Grantville Gazette, the International Journal of the Book, Newsweek, Paste, Smashing Magazine, that sort of thing. And a lot of that comes from the fact that my day job is as a graphic designer and user experience designer, but I'm also a historian. I have a master. We were just talking about education before this. I have a master's in history as well. And so a lot of these different influences, be they technology and history and whatnot, sort of combine in what I write. So I've got a couple sci-fi historical fiction pieces out in the world, and I'm working on a hard science fiction novel length piece right now. I am proudly a member of the SFWA, and I have a killer agent, Andy Zack at the Zack Company as well. So very happy to be living the writer's life, even while I have the day job living the designer's life as well.
All right. So tell me a little bit about Calamity.
So Calamity is, I think one of my favorite sort of descriptions I heard of the book was that it was as if Quintin Tarrintino wrote a feminist Western memoir. So it's sort of a violent reimagining of the very young years of Calamity Jane, about which very little is known. She was sort of a notorious liar and alcoholic and self-aggrandizer and self-promoter. And a lot of her biographies, really, her real honest to God biography, is really hard to decipher. But I chose to set the story well before all that, when she was 15 years old, in the years following the Civil War. And it really tells the story of Calamity Jane and an alien gunslinger known as the Green Man as they travel through the Wild West, or what I like to call the Wilder West, over the course of about 9 months. And it's very much a coming of age story for her as she transitions from the woman she was to the woman that sort of history, or at least that she wanted history to remember. But it's also very much, I hope, a fun sci-fi Western adventure, as these two others, as I like to think of them. They're both sort of people outside the Wild West mainstream, a woman and an alien, or in this case, sort of the ultimate immigrant, sort of clash with the environment that was the American West.
All right, you're going to have to fill me in a little bit more on Calamity Jane, because I don't recall much about her from my days of studying history ages ago.
Sure, yeah, and she's a really messy character, which is what makes her, I think, really interesting, because there are a number of very popular pop culture depictions of her. I think the most recent chronologically, and the one that I really encountered the first, was the one in the show Deadwood, which was an HBO show, maybe a dozen or more or years ago at this point. But before that, she'd been played by a wide variety of Hollywood actresses, either played as a heroine or as something of a foil for other great Wild West characters like Wild Bill Hickok and that sort of thing. So the true history of her is somewhere in between what Hollywood presents and what she presents, and what was maybe a more typical Western experience. She was a very young woman, a young teenager, when her family migrated from Arkansas, ultimately out to the Salt Lake area. Her parents did not survive the trip, and so in her teenage years, she became independent. There's this big black hole where we know she was in the Salt Lake and Western Wyoming areas before she sort of emerges later as someone who claimed to have been a scout for General Custer, who claimed to have been, and actually, definitely was in the party of Wild Bill Hickok, and ultimately settled in the Deadwood area, where she was more notorious for being an alcoholic and something of a troublemaker. But she worked very hard to promote this image of her as a frontierswoman who could compete with the guys, and was everywhere someone wanted to be historically. The degree to which that's true is hard to discern. Now, when I found her, I was graduate student at the University of Georgia. I studied history. And so I kind of went back to the oldest books I could find about her. I had not grown up really super into Western, so it was sort of a blank slate for me. Ultimately, I was less concerned about what was true or not in terms of her later biography. There were a handful of facts about her youthful biography that seemed to be more or less true. And I was really fascinated with this idea that here was someone who was born Martha Jane Canary or Martha Jane Cannery. I've heard it pronounced both ways, but ultimately becomes famous as this other person, and a transformation had to happen somewhere along the way. So that's the story I was interested in looking at, was how does someone go from being, an orphaned pioneer headed out west to someone around whom so much Western lore exists. And again, all this is in the context of me not being a fan of Westerns growing up. So I came at this very late, so to speak, in terms of looking into her as the character.
But what a wonderful character to develop. And like you said, you don't care about those later years. You just care about how she got to those later years. And that's where you filled in the gaps.
Yeah. So, and the West is not short of inspiration for things to have her do, right? Like, even if we just know, or in this case, we just know with some certainty that she was in Piedmont, Wyoming around 1867, right there's more than enough material to build an entire story out of. So much less dropping in a spaceman, much less having her get, wrapped up in the dispute between personalities based on real historical figures within the state of Wyoming, like the people who sort of ran the town of Piedmont, Wyoming, and how they fit into the bigger picture of what was going on in Wyoming at the time. But the West in general, right? So because you had the persecution of the native tribes, you had the pioneers heading out west. Many of those pioneers do not fit sort of our image nowadays of sort of what people in the stagecoaches look like. They were a much more diverse group of people than we typically think about. And it was really interesting for me. I think when I started looking into Calamity Jane, my primary exposure to the Wild West had been the movie Young Guns with Emilio Estevez and the miniseries Lonesome Dove with Robert Duvall. And so, and while those are fun, they don't necessarily present the West as it really was, right? So again, one of the things that I learned very early on was about 1 in 4 cowboys were Black, whereas if you watch something like Lonesome Dove, it's very rare to see a Black American in the mix, right? But you've got this migration of many people who either didn't want to participate in life in the East or couldn't participate in life in the East, moving out west into more of a state of nature environment where someone like a 15-year-old girl could compete realistically with men in certain environments. And so again, that's really what made what I thought an interesting story to tell. And I think there's a lot of similarity too between what the Wild West presents as a sort of narrative setting and my passion growing up, which was science fiction. There's an enormous overlap, I think, between the stories those two genres tend to tell. And so I had definitely had some agents along the way sort of shake their head at why put an alien into the Wild West, where it seems very organic to me that an alien fits actually super well into the Wild West. We just normally do it the other way and tell Westerns in a sci-fi skin, like Star Wars or Mad Max or something like that, than the reverse, which is to tell the sci-fi story around a Western skin.
But what was it like to write the voice of a woman in a Western?
Yeah, so this is like the most flattering piece of feedback I typically get. I've over the years had a number of people, I've had some agents be surprised when I met them and they discovered I was a guy, or I've had some readers express surprise when I met them and they learned I was a man, especially in that I'm all those things. Like I'm a cis, white, hetero, middle-class guy, right? So I'm very much in this particular niche. But I remember my current wife, on our first date, which was ostensibly I wanted to get her feedback on the book, she was thrilled at how I had written a female character and that was great feedback for me. I think that ultimately for me, it wasn't as much about writing a woman as it was about writing someone that had the particular issues that Jane had that I also had, right? Like, so if you talk about as writers, we're often told to write what we know. And so when I looked at Calamity Jane, I can know the setting, I can research that. I can research her biography as much as I can, but the things about her that were also things about me, those are the things that I leaned into writing the most about. So the fact that she has sort of a temper is something that I don't really have much of one anymore, but I was in a place when I wrote the book where that was something I struggled with, right? And so a lot of her struggles about temper, about feeling abandoned, about feeling sort of other to the group of people she was with, those are all things that I was able to feel as well. And sort of, so writing her actually was a little more therapeutic or a little more like commiserating with someone than it was trying to imagine what it was like to be someone else. The stuff that's expressly female, in terms of experience or in terms of thought, I hope this comes from the fact that in my profession, I'm a user experience designer by profession, and empathy is an enormous part of that job. You're designing solutions for other people. So you have to know a lot about what those other people's pain points are, what their needs are. And I think as a writer, the same is true. If you're telling a story that's about anything other than your own direct experience, you have to try to inform yourself about what it was like to be that person. So I think sort of the practice of professional empathy and not just trying to make her fit my experience, but trying to write something that was more her experience made the exercise a lot more interesting to me. At least I hope that's what it is, because right now I'm writing about a narcissist, and I really don't want to think that that's coming from me, more coming from my experience with narcissists or researching narcissism and that sort of stuff. So that's part of what makes writing fun. And in this particular case, that was one of the most rewarding pieces of feedback I've heard over the years. Is I'm glad to have done it well.
Tell me about your publishing journey.
So I have not historically been a super prolific writer in terms of how frequently I write. I have a big family. I have an active career, so I don't write as often as I'd like. I like to think that I maintain more of a George R.R. Martin pace, but maybe without yet his HBO success. But we'll get there, I'm sure. So my writing journey was a little bit longer in that. So when I started thinking about this book and went through the research phase with it, that by itself took me a few years in terms of from when I thought of the book to when I thought I had it well enough to start writing it. And I stumbled a little bit in starting to write it. I think I overwrote a couple of those first chapters when I was trying to find the voice for the book, because I wish I could go back and look at them. I have vague memories of what the first starts to this book were before I realized they were terrible and had to start over again. But the book was basically written in two bursts. The first third of the book, which was originally written as a novella, was written over the course of 6 or so months. And then I had a kid, so I took a little bit of a break, and then I came back, sort of revisited that first part of it because the story had grown in my imagination, and over the course of the next 6 months or so finished out the novel. And a lot of writers, at least I didn't appreciate at the time, a lot of writers think that that's the hardest part of the job. And it is hard to get the book out, to be sure. Once you've done that, like, I'm a big believer in celebrating all the milestones, right? So when you write chapter 1, celebrate. When you get through the first act, celebrate. When you get done, absolutely celebrate. But now the hard work of editing and promoting and finding an agent, and that working with that agent to find a publisher, that the business of writing takes time as well. And so it took me a little while to find a good agent and a good publisher. I was really fortunate. I live in Atlanta, in the Atlanta area. So here we have a very active group called the Atlanta Writers Club, which has hundreds of members and does 2 annual conferences. And I'm very good friends with some of the organizers of that group. So I had a really good support network in terms of how to meet agents and editors and how to work with them. And ultimately ended up meeting Andy Zack at the Zack Company, who his team really felt passionate about the book, which was exciting. You know, it's really great when other people love your baby too. And so working with them, we were able to get it in print. And so the journey was not short, but I'm very happy with where it ended up. I'm a big believer too that usually the first steps are the hardest steps. So I'm hoping that by the time the next book comes out, I'll have a slightly easier journey than with the first book, but because I still do have a great relationship with my agent. But yeah, I think there's I didn't write just Calamity. I was trying to write multiple things. And one of the best metaphors I've ever heard for what the creative process is like, and I believe it came from a now defunct podcast called TLDR. But it was that a creative person is metaphorically someone standing in a field with a lightning rod. So the more creative you are, that's the more lightning rods you're holding up into the sky. And the better the creative piece you make, the longer the lightning rod. The issue is that there are thousands and thousands of other people in that field there too. So there is some of the matter of luck if you're going to get struck by lightning or not. But being prolific and and producing work of quality, both of those things work to your advantage. So while I was working on Calamity, I was also working on short stories. I had another novel in the works, which that's the one I'm currently rewriting. So it was just, all of that sort of helped get me in front of people, and ultimately helped me land the publishing relationship that ended up working out for me in the end.
What a great journey that you have. And thank you for sharing that information. JD Jordan, how could people find out more about Calamity? How can they find out more about you and the other things on your to-do list?
I think the main site would be my website, o-jd.com. Of course, I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook a little bit. I'm kind of phasing out of Facebook, but o-jd.com is the main spot. I've got a couple free shorts up there. There's the first chapter for Calamity is available there. Links to all my goodies are out there as well. And links, the audiobook for Calamity, which came out about a year and a half ago, is also linked to from there. I know a lot of people prefer the audio to the printed, so that option is available as well.
I know, as a literature professor, I'm never quite sure what I think about audiobooks, although I do download some every now and then.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great for even though most of us don't have to, or at least I don't have to drive to work anymore. It is nice for when I do. That's for sure.
Yeah, I will listen to books when I'm doing my run or my walk. Mm-hmm. With take the dog out and you just put some earbuds in and it's no big deal.
Yeah, very much.
But JD, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
Sure, I'll give it a go.
All right. Do you have a motto or a mantra that you like to live by?
I don't know that it's a motto or a mantra per se, but I'm a big believer in sort of the Zen and Stoic concepts, where it's like it's probably easier to do it right now than to put it off and come back and do it later. So as someone who's sort of had struggles with anxiety, I find that it's extremely helpful. Or I think there's a great book called Getting Things Done, where they really talk about this too. If you're asked to do something and it can be done in 5 to 10 minutes right now, just go ahead and knock it out. And I think that falls in line with the whole it's better to start better to start now than to try to wait for the situation to be perfect. That whole progress, not perfection sort of attitude towards things.
Do you have a favorite television show?
I'm a huge Star Trek nerd. So I grew up watching Star Trek, and I'm kind of thrilled that there's sort of a renaissance of Star Trek right now. I think my favorite show at the moment has probably been Strange New Worlds. It's really, I think, the sort of episodic Star Trek we've been missing probably since The Next Generation. So that's pretty fantastic.
And my third question, do you have a favorite dessert?
A favorite dessert? Okay, so this is tricky. I recently became gluten intolerant, but I have a huge sweet tooth. So I would probably still say key lime pie. I just have to be real shy about the crust.
Well, JD Jordan, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. Alison out. Woo! We're all done. JD Jordan is the award-winning author of the acclaimed sci-fi Western novel, Calamity, being an account of Calamity Jane and her gunslinging green man, and has also been featured in Creative Loafing, the Grantville Gazette, the International Journal of the Book, Newsweek, Paste, and Smashing Magazine. He is also an award-winning graphic designer, design educator, and historian with experience working with some of the biggest agencies and brands in the Southeast. JD is a member of the SFWA and is represented by the Zack Company. For more information and details, visit his press kit at o-jd.com. Join the Florida Writers Association for a weekend jam-packed with networking opportunities, workshops, awards, book signings, and a youth summit with lots more. Friday, October 28th to Sunday, October 30th. The Florida Writer Youth Summit, Saturday, October 29th. Visit floridawriters.org for more information. Until next time.